So now let's start with the book. The first chapter is a fascinating look at a life from 1870 to the early 1880s, as it introduces the idea of learning to live with your weaknesses as well as with your strengths. Overall, these first few chapters show insights into growing up back in the days before electricity and no cars, no internet. She also tells of the serious issues with her eyes, health issues such as constantly fainting that prevented her from attending school. So she was educated by her parents and learned from conversations with her father while riding in a wagon as he delivered medicines and pre-electric sewing machines or organs for playing music. So this meant she also missed much of the dogma about how society functions that most kids pick up at school. I think this contributed to her being an independent thinker. This chapter is a fascinating look at a resourceful family, her father's journey from pharmacy to law, and how many of her lifelong interests were rooted in things that she learned as a child. So let's start chapter 1. There is a note in my diary which reads, July 18th, 1910. This afternoon, I was impressed to give Mrs. Wenzel a treatment, after which she is much improved. I wonder now, I happened to write that entry just so casually, when actually that experience was a turning point in my life. I was deeply stirred when this healing power first began to come through me. I still am. Although I use the gift of healing daily, it is amazing to me and occasionally strikes home its wonder beyond words. The reason I set down that entry as a kind of landmark is because it stands testimony to a long struggle to rise out of myself. From then on, I was more porous to the spirit. When the power for healing first began to rise in me, I do not know if I had to set down a date. I would point to an afternoon in 1907 when a friend said to me, "You have the saddest face I have ever seen." I was tremendously taken aback by her words. To be sure, my life was difficult. It was stark. I felt overwhelmed by my family problems, but I surely did not know that I was casting gloom over everyone I met. I took a long look at myself in the mirror and began to pray daily, many times each day, that God would help me at least to have a cheerful face. I had enough sense to know that cheer comes from helping other people, so I prayed earnestly, avidly, to be shown how to help every single person I met. Then the obvious thing began to happen. My opportunities were suddenly unlimited. Each friend and acquaintance became an adventure. Gradually, my health improved and my faith grew as I was filled with assurance that God was using me, however humbly, for his own purposes. At times, I felt an exuberant vitality, which is different from the physical vitality of health, more like a charge which rises in meditation. It was a new experience. On that particular July day, I had dropped in to see Mrs. Wenzel, who had been an invalid for a number of years. She had had 5 operations, as everyone knew, and had become a miserable arthritic, practically confined to her chair and bed. In fact, she could move so little that she had given up her home, stored her furnishings, and was living in a hotel. That afternoon, she was suffering excruciating pain. I thought I could not stand to see any human being so twisted with pain and so blanched of the face. She was sitting in a big chair propped up by many cushions, which gave her no comfort. I felt such a desire to just lay my hands on her that I told her she must get back in bed, although I had no idea how I would ever get her there. Perspiration drenched her from the exertion and pain of moving, but I put my hands on her, one beneath her shoulders and the other on her chest. We both felt the quickening sensation that pulsed between my hands, and she said, "Well, what are you doing? Did you ever do this kind of thing before?" I told her no. But I knew that this was a healing current and she should take it in. And she did just that. She grew quiet and was soon sound asleep. The next morning, she walked down to breakfast, astounding everyone who knew her, including herself, including me too, for that matter. After 3 treatments, she was well. That was all there was to it. She was well, and she moved back into her own home, and she stayed well. I knew that healing was my work, which Dr. Julia Walton had intimated 6 years previously. There have not been many times in the 40-odd years of busy service which followed when the power coming through me has resulted in such an immediate and spectacular cure as it did for Mrs. Wenzel. I think that God, through my father and helpers from the other side, gave me that dramatic demonstration so that I would trust the power working through me. Just the same, the discovery of a new ability startles an adult. We never quite take it in that we have all sorts of latent capabilities, which we can call on in a time of need. In a way, I should not have been surprised because by that time in my life, I was in my late 30s. The unusual had already become customary. Still, there is always some kind of drag within us, which makes us hesitate to be different. We want to be like other people, inconspicuous in endowments, which are not popularly accepted as enviable. One of my first memories of acute childish suffering, because I could not do the other things that other children did, and no doubt the memory of my longing to be strong and robust has colored my desire to help others who are held back physically. At the time, I should have started school, but could not. I recall hearing people say, "Oh, she has weak eyes." But I think few people, except for my father, knew just how weak they were. They also said, "She isn't strong. She faints easily." And they were likely to add in a whisper, "But the wonder is that she has lived." They looked at my mother respectfully as the one who has come through perils beyond expectation. She had indeed, incredibly, survived a very serious illness during a pregnancy. But I wonder now if it was not primarily a matter of spiritual adjustments, which made the early days of her marriage distressing to the point where her body took over this burden. When my mother married my father, she was a jolly girl, easily given to laughter. She had recently been graduated from a fashionable young ladies' seminary in Coldwater, Michigan. My father was tall and good-looking and always resourceful, always kind. I know now that they were well-mated in every way, but at that time, their difficulty was that Papa had no financial resources of his own, having just finished Hamilton College, when he and his new little wife went to live with Papa's father on his farm near Utica, New York. Grandfather Rhodes was Pennsylvania Dutch and stern. He was upright. He was honorable. He was also set in his ways, and one of the ways he was set in was in meeting life with due solemnity. He did not understand my fun-loving mother. However, they did have one thing in common, whether he meant it to be so or not. They were both very fond of flowers. Indeed, grandfather had a kind of holy passion for flowers. His flower garden was enclosed by a white picket fence, and no one dared enter that garden. It may have been that grandmother loved the garden too, but she had died before my mother came to live there. Grandfather seldom spoke, and his words were feared by all the family. He had not spoken to my mother for months before I was born. And after a while, she had ceased to try to even talk to him. For a newborn baby, the spiritual climate of that household was somewhat chilly. My grandfather, never predictable, must have gone through some kind of rapid inner mellowing, because when I was 2 hours old, he came into my mother's bedroom and laid a big red rose on the pillow beside me and said, "Now we have 2 red roses." Thus, that October 14th, 1871 was a gala day, not so much because a small girl child had joined the circle, as because the sudden warm understanding was born between my grandfather Rhodes and my mother. Some weeks afterwards, my father went to St. Cloud, Minnesota to join a friend, George Spencer, in order to open a drugstore. It was the only drugstore in a large stretch of countryside, and hence Papa became rather a man of affairs. He sent for Mama and me. It was reported that we rode on trains traversing wooden rails, and the way was very rough and the atmosphere was very smoky. Papa could not get to Minneapolis in time to meet the train, but he had directed that we should go to the West Hotel, then the largest and best hotel in the Northwest. That January was extremely cold, and the clerk put us in a small room without heat. Mama was only 20 years old, unused to having a new baby, and also unused to city ways. She called for milk and for heat, but neither warmth nor food came. My father was staying in the same hotel to meet us, and repeatedly asked at the hotel desk, and frantically meeting every train at the station. Now remember that this was long before cell phones and the internet, and people had to make plans to meet in advance, and there was no way to get in contact when things went wrong. So after 2 fearful days of this, someone said to him, "There's a girl with a baby on the 3rd floor." I've heard the story of their meeting so many times that I feel I remember it, and I'm glad I was present. But I am also glad I was not present when my father settled with the hotel management. My first actual memory reaches back before my third birthday to a day I decided to sew a doll's quilt on the sewing machine. It was my finger instead of the quilt which caught the needle. Mama took me to the drugstore where Dr. Gilman lanced the blood blister. The part I remember is how they were praising me for not crying when suddenly I saw that a drop of blood was on my new white dress, and then I was inconsolable. Another day, just before I was 3, I was taken to a neighbor's house to visit, and I was terribly homesick. The desolation of that visit still sweeps out from my memory. And then Papa came for me and told me I had a little sister whose name was Bertha. I also remember a day shortly before my sister was born when Mama and I went to spend the afternoon with her friend Cora Cramb. She had an organ, and I begged her to play. I recall sitting on the floor at her feet and staring at the badly worn red carpet on the organ pedals. Mrs. Cram repeated the same hymn over and over while I kept saying, "More, more." That evening at home, I stood by the piano, just able to reach the keys, and I finally picked out the melody that she had played. The song was, "Shall We Gather at the River?" The excitement of finding that melody in the keys still lingers with me. When I was 5, Papa and Mama left us children with Aunt Franc, my mother's aunt, while they went to the Philadelphia Exposition. As they drove off to the depot, Mama waved and threw a kiss. But Papa did not turn around. I cried about that. But later, Mama told us the reason was because he was crying too. During the following years, Papa drove through the country selling sewing machines and organs to farmers. We had a big bay horse whose name was Old Tige. He was like one of the family and sometimes would actually come into the kitchen for sugar or candy. He could lift the door latches, turn the knobs on the feed boxes. That horse always knew his way home. After driving for a long day and selling all his machines, Papa would tie the reins to the dashboard and say, "Oh, go home, Tige," and then lie down in the wagon box and sleep until the horse stopped at our barn. Roads were deeply rutted and narrow in those days, and it took some maneuvering to pass another vehicle on the country road. But old Tige, with Papa asleep, would pull off to the side of the road and wait for another wagon to pass. When I was 6 years old, we moved to Little Falls, Minnesota, where Papa had started another drugstore, also the first in that locality. The town was small, and there were no vacant houses, so that we had to live in a vacant store building. It made a pleasant home, and when I heard someone comment on my mother's resourcefulness, I felt as if I belonged to a brave family. Still, from some unknown source, I get the idea that my parents were not ready to meet the hereafter because I recall climbing the stairs to the vacant room and kneeling on the musty floor and praying to God to save my mother and father. Perhaps few persons needed such prayers less. It could be that I had heard comments on the fact that my parents did not attend church. Mama had played the organ in church for years before she became ill, but Papa never attended church until after Mama died. And then he became a worker and speaker in the Little Falls Baptist Church. It was the year I was 8 that my mother was ill for many weeks. Indeed, she was never really well after that time. Sick in bed, and the phrase usually denoted serious illness because the pioneer women kept on about their tasks through any ordinary sickness. My father tried desperately to find a hired girl, as we said. One day, he headed out with some determination to find someone, somehow, before nightfall. The girl he brought home was a husky, smiling German girl named Harrie Vernig. She had no idea of working out because she was engaged to marry a man named John, but Mama's plight moved her warm heart, and she stayed with us for 5 years. Patient John often came to the house. I thought the situation was so romantic, the noble girl, true to her duty while her ardent lover waited. Just before her wedding day, my father asked Mary what she wanted from our household for a wedding present. She answered promptly, "The thing I'd like most is the dining room table, so I'll have a big table enough to seat all of you folks when you come to see me." Our average meals were about a dozen people, so the table was a bit large for just 2. But Mary got the table. It was also during my 8th year that Mary taught me to knit. Knitting was not so only a useful pastime for a woman child, but it was also a thing I could do without strain on my eyes. Mama had a large skein of rich blue yarn in a lovely shade, but it was terribly tangled and tightly matted. She said I could have it if I could straighten it out. I worked on that yarn for a whole year, releasing only a few inches in hours. Years afterwards, my gratitude swept out to Mary for teaching me to knit. When my own children were sick, I used to rock the cradle with my foot and knit, sometimes sound asleep. At least my sister Cora insists that she watched me knit several inches on a stocking without waking until I finally dropped a stitch. It has never been a credit to me to knit because I take such satisfaction in the rhythmic movement of the needles and the tranquility of mind that it ensues. During the First World War, I knitted 43 pairs of long men's socks while riding on streetcars to make sick calls. During the Second World War, the Red Cross used to send me bundles of 25 to 30 impossible sweaters to be unraveled in whole or in part and reknit. In all, I made over 800 garments, mostly sweaters for the soldiers. Every spare minute between patients was utilized. I have not wanted to knit since then. During my growing years, we were a lively family. There was Papa, Mama, Bertha, Cora, Carrie, Lillian, Francis, who died in early childhood, and baby George, who lived only a few hours. And then when I was 19, my brother Cal was born, and named after my father's law firm, Taylor, Calhoun, and Rhodes. My mother's aunt, Frances E. Babbitt, also lived with us. She studied Indian life, wrote books and articles, and could teach 7 languages. I recall that she had pupils studying French and German, and I longed to get into those books. But there was always the weakness of my eyes to reckon with. Sometimes Aunt Frank took Bertha and me down to the banks of the Mississippi River. We dug out white quartz and many Indian relics, which we carried home in a grape basket. Aunt Frank scoured our findings with soap suds and toothbrushes and later polished the best ones, which today are in her exhibit at the Smithsonian Institute. Now, if you search on Frances E. Babbitt, she was one of the first women archaeologists. A Wikipedia article has links to some of her published works. So besides our big family, we had boarders who lived with us. The town was small and had few accommodations. We told ourselves it was just as easy to cook for 12 as for 8, and probably we were right. There were many school teachers, but I remember one because she was part Indian and very beautiful. I thought she must surely be related to Longfellow's Minnehaha. And I also remember John Wenzel because it was his dog who chewed the face off my first wax doll. She had eyes that opened and shut, which was a really unusual thing in those days. I cried and cried with the unrelieved grief peculiar to children. But when John whipped the dog with a stick, I suddenly realized that the pain of a living thing was far worse than any loss. And then my grief was half terror, and I could not cry. It was our father who was our passionate delight. He was a tall man and well-proportioned. His hair was light and thick. His eyes were very blue. Whenever he was not too busy, he would play games with us. Sometimes he would lie on the floor and we would all sit on him. We thought it was a wonderful game. Mama said that in the evening she could tell when Papa came in sight because we would all scream and run flying out of the house to see who could reach him first to hold his hands. It was a pity he had only 2 hands, but they were large and sometimes a finger would suffice. When I was 10 or 11, he bought a farm of 2,100 acres about 10 miles from town where they raised fine horses and Holstein cows. A Holstein was a novelty in those days and highly prized. More than any of the other children, I drove with him back and forth to the farm because I was the fragile one who could not go to school and needed to be outdoors. While I was with him, I would forget the set apartness of not being able to frolic off to school to learn important things as the other children did. As we drove along, we sang together, or Papa recited poetry to me. His favorite songs were Civil War things from his youth, like Poor Nellie Gray, Tramp, Tramp, Tramp. But he sang a whole range of his college songs too. Papa liked to quote poetry almost as well as he liked to sing. John Godfrey Saxe and Shakespeare were among his favorites. The pioneers had eclectic tastes. Almost every day after meals, he would say, "However it be, it seems to me 'tis only noble to be good. Kind hearts are more than coronets, and simple faith than Norman blood." Translated, that means to be noble, means to be good. Kind hearts are more important than crowns, and simple faith is more noble than royal bloodlines. We asked if we had Norman blood, and Papa, with a bow to Mama, assured us that we had, and simple faith too. Harrie's mother was Ellen Perrigo Rhodes, and she had ancestors from northern France, so they did technically have Norman blood. By the time I remember my mother, she was a round little body, all curves and comfort. In fact, comfort was her keynote, and she could not bear to have anyone uncomfortable. I heard her say, "I never let a child go to sleep until we kiss and make up." She was always jolly too, given to laughter and quick appreciation. As I think of her, she was every bit as good an artist as Ines. Her pictures, especially Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard, had his same restful colors. No doubt she had the best boarding school technique, but I think perhaps she really had a bit more. Bertha, next younger than I, was all artist. When she was around 6 years old, she took a yellow stone from our yard and drew a picture on the sidewalk of a man who lived at the end of our block. When the neighboring men came home to dinner, they stopped to laugh, and one said, "Oh, look, that's old Sig." I was impressed. Bertha also loved cats, tamed gophers, and was good training for one who would later originate and manage a new kind of playground and play techniques for the underprivileged children in the city. As an adult, Sister Bertha also wrote the Little American Books series for children. Cora was orderly, kept her clothes cleaner than the rest of us did, and besides, she could saw and hammer. She built cupboards that looked like the store-bought ones. Like my mother, she loved horses. She could master and drive any horse. Fragile child that I was, I would stand transfixed with admiration and anxiety as I witnessed her skill with the big horses. But she had her quiet side too, and she liked to sew, making her own clothes, almost before I can remember. Carrie was fat and funny, with a zest for many activities, but absolutely no sense of order. I don't know which was captivating me more, her never flagging energy or her fine disregard for the adage about everything having a place. I wonder now how Mama knew so well how to handle each one of us. But of course, behind our mother was always our father. In those days, we never heard the word psychic, but I know that my sister Lillian had a strong psychic gift, and she saw events before they happened. She also had an innate selflessness. After Mama died, Lillian would hide in her clothes closet and cry her heart out. But before Papa came home, she would always have her face washed and be smiling. Lillian died when she was 12, just a few weeks after Mama in 1892. From babyhood, Cal was interested in drawing and machinery, given to close observation, and as a child to quaint comments. One time, as the cows came into the barnyard, mooing incessantly, he came running into the house. "Come quick and see the cow playing on her horns." I want to interrupt here to explain this joke, which flew past me the first time. Cal thought that the cows were playing their horns as a musical instrument in order to make the moo sound. I think maybe he had to be there. So back to the book. Another time I found him standing out in the garden with his feet firmly planted in the soil, thinking that would make him grow faster. My father never had a music lesson, but when he played his violin, he could make folks laugh or cry at will. And when he was home, he carried his violin under his arm and played a little before and after meals, as well as on Sunday. Mama was a fine pianist, having studied music in the Young Ladies Seminary, where progressive women could get a university education. When I was still young, they would help me on the piano stool, and then I would accompany the chords to accompany my papa's violin. My fingers would find their own way. Father and I played a game called Magic Music. I do not know to this date where the creativity of the artist leaves off and the so-called psychic ability begins. Maybe the margin between the two is movable. Certainly there is an uncharted area. Looking back, I'm not sure whether our success depended entirely on musical sensitivity and personal understanding, or whether perhaps I was exercising a degree of clairvoyance, an unfamiliar concept at the time. At any rate, no one else in the neighborhood could perform the wonders of music magic that we had performed. The game was for me to go outside, usually clear across the yard, while guests decided on some stunt I was to do. Then when I was called back into the room, my father began to play what he called magic music tune. As I walked, he played a sharp staccato note, and if I took one wrong step, he played slow legato notes. so he would guide me. One time I recall I had to cross the room between two rows of chairs. Some 20 people were in the room. I had to reach into a certain man's vest pocket, find a little penknife, carry it across the room, half open it, and then hang it on another man's ear. Once I had a letter hidden in a big dictionary and then carried it to a lady and put it in her pocket. Many individuals who came to town, especially musicians, would visit us to try to discover our trick. But no one ever discovered anything. Years later, after my father died, I had an experience when he appeared to me and he said, "Now we will play our magic music again, and I will lead you the right way." Each year of my childhood, I pleaded, go to school. This being different to the point of being kept home was more than I could bear. Each opening day of school, I would try again, but before the first half day was over, I would faint and become ill or have to go home. Then I would have to stay in bed for a few days. This is the end of chapter 1.